Excited to see everybody here today. Thanks for staying inside on a beautiful noontime day. So I'm Marin Bizdeck. I'm the manager of the Historic Preservation Division for the City of Fort Collins, and my colleague Rebecca Shields is here with me. She's a specialist on our team, and we're really excited to talk to you about historic contexts and how they can support local preservation programs. It's fun to see that Denver is going to be coming up, and there will be that opportunity to kind of compare and contrast the different ways that we work with contexts in our different programs. So what we're going to do today is we're going to share a basic overview of what historic contexts are, just to make sure we all, understand that. I know we've got a mix of audience, and some people are more familiar than others, but also we kind of took the approach that we wanted to share some tips for how to think creatively about what historic contexts are and how you can use them to support your goals. So we've got some kind of outside the box thinking as well that we want to share with you. And we'll save some time at the end for Q&A, and look forward to hearing your ideas as well. And we'll just jump right in.
Slide, historic contexts, other forms and meanings.
And Becca, you can switch slides. Okay, great. So just as a starting point, we wanted to encourage you to consider the idea that historic contexts can take a few different forms beyond that traditional idea of how we think about them as a formal report. And so in that framework, they can go by different names. They can exist at different scales. In other words, when you think about the fact that in our local preservation programs, we're constantly producing community history that supports the work that we do, even when we don't have a formal historic context study underway. And so what we try to do at Fort Collins is marry those things together as much as we can. And essentially that research and writing that we're doing on an ongoing basis can feed into formal grant-funded context reports. We can also use those formal context reports that we produce over time to create more abbreviated content for other purposes. So that dynamic relationship between those two approaches in both directions is what we want to try to convey today. So that primary form that we all are familiar with is that formal historic context report, also known as a context statement, but also consider that well-supported nomination forms, staff reports, summary statements for policy documents, web content, those types of things are also historic contexts in sort of a mini form. And what they all have in common in the context of historic preservation, regardless of the order in which they're produced or the way that they're produced, is that they help us understand local history through place-based stories. And I think people that are sometimes like new on commissions or have worked in other realms of public history, this is a really important thing to remember. We have a lot of colleagues that produce local history through various lenses, but of course what we're doing is providing that place-based lens, those place-based stories. And so historic contexts in some way are always connected to place.
4 circles are linked on the slide.
Go to the next slide.
Slide, what is an historic context officially?
So just kind of thinking about that formal or official idea of an historic context report, or a context statement, as some of us call them. A specialized form of writing is what we really need to understand about it. It's tightly focused on a particular theme, a particular geographic area, a particular phase of the community's development over time. And again, with an emphasis on how the built environment has reflected that story over time. So in particular, of course, as preservationists, we're concerned with what remains to tell that story. And because formal reports are used specifically to create that framework for analysis and thinking comparatively about the associated property types and those resources that do remain to tell that story, that they need to provide a set of associated property types in that report that gives us that basis or that rationale for doing further analysis in the future. And typically, they need to have a strong component of outlining what physical characteristics, what aspects of design, what aspects of integrity are most important in order to tell that particular story. So despite that really specialized purpose that we're using in our preservation programs, and they're of course produced by experts in the field of architectural history, community history. They should always be written for a general audience. And so we always want our context reports to be readable by people of different reading levels, ideally, and also ideally have the opportunity to have those reports in translation where they're particularly going to be read by people who are not speaking English as their primary language. And that's, that's a whole separate conversation, but it's something that when you have a backlog of historic contexts that haven't been translated, you have to kind of think about how are we going to translate at least some of this key information to make it accessible to the community. Okay, next slide. And it's also important to consider that it takes a few years. If you participated in the development of a historic context report, you know that from conceptualizing what your community needs, putting that in the context of the work that you're doing, finding a professional consultant through an RFP process, all of those things, and of course applying for grants, assuming it's going to be grant funded. You're talking about several years, from start to finish. And in the interim, we're all busy doing our work and we're needing that information. And we may be actually gathering or discovering information that's relevant to that work that is stretched out over a period of time, because it's just coming to us incrementally, as we go about our business. So one of the things that I think we want to posit is that it's really helpful to get creative with your existing resources to kind of create that dynamic interplay, with the caveat that if you're going to be producing information that is kind of interim information, or information that is going to be a while before you can get funded and do a formal context report, or maybe it's just never going to end up getting done as a project like that, the caveat is we always are paying attention to sound research practices, best practices for responsible sharing of information. That's not something that we can be loose about, but within that essential, overarching guideline, there's a lot of things that we can do. So, where that formal historic context report and then follow-on survey reports, follow-on landmark nominations that build on that context can become, basically your Bible on that particular subject for your community over a long period of time. That's still going to be, at some point, it's going to start to age, right? It's going to start to get a little bit stale. And so how are you going to create more flexible content in the form of living documents, web content, video scripts, and the like that relate to that work? And so that kind of activity, regardless of where it fits on, kind of your timeline, really depends, as far as who's going to do those things. It depends on the size of your community, the size of your staff, and then what kind of resources you have to partner with to kind of expand your bandwidth to do this kind of work. And so, when we've done those kinds of day-to-day local history projects that often end up as, like, say, web content, living documents on our website, we're typically, reliant on just those quickly available secondary sources. We always include some kind of caveat about the nature of those documents, the nature of that information, the way it's produced, and most importantly, what's missing from the process, because we always want to distinguish between sort of levels of information. When we've got a formally funded study versus something that, staff has produced, we have different phrases we use for it, but one of them is, mini context. We also talk about just kind of doing the ready production of things. So whatever the size of your paid staff is, and whether or not you have, other partners in the community that can help you produce these things, again, will vary. But just, to kind of get that thinking process going, Some of us work with on-call consultants, so we don't always consider different ways to scope out projects for them. Sometimes they can be tasked with just providing a broader background context on a particular subject that you need. If you know that, let's just say, there's some development activity that's come up in a particular part of town that you don't really know much about, that kind of thing. So there are ways to kind of fill the gaps. And you may have partner history institutions at local archives and museums. And if you sit down with them and you think creatively, there are things that you can do in these shorter version projects that I'm talking about. So those are kind of the ends of the spectrum that I just wanted to kind of lay out for you. But then I think we'll go into some examples of what our program has been working on over time. And we will provide a link at the end to all of our contexts that are organized on our website. But in the meantime, just going to give you some examples here. So, and these are different types of contexts that were produced under different circumstances. And so I hope they'll help kind of illustrate the ways in which you can both be proactive in anticipating community needs that contexts can support, and also ways in which you can be responsive to needs that come up. So, and I think something wacky's happening there with the slide, but oh, there you go. Okay, so we're in the end stage. The project you see on the left there, we're in the end stage of wrapping that up. That's a State Historical Fund grant produced project, Civil Rights in Fort Collins. It is the core chapter or a core chapter in a larger kind of trajectory of context work that we're planning that fits under the concept of full story Fort Collins. So in particular, that long-term project that we expect to be working on for many years is determined to fill gaps created by excluding and underrepresenting multiple community groups, in past documentation. So I think, we're all working with some version of that problem, depending on the existing context we may have and how dated they are, because of course our field has changed quite a bit. Our methodology, our approach to equity and inclusivity, all of those things are constantly evolving. And so one of the things that we're focusing on now is adding new information to supplement information that's missing, and then also thinking about how that new information supports us rethinking places that we're already familiar with, rethinking new bases for significance for sites that are recognized for other reasons. So one nice thing about this particular civil rights history project, first of all, it's an intersectional story. So, when we thought about, just from a strategic planning perspective, how are we going to set ourselves up for context reports in the future that have greater community involvement? One of the things that we recognized is we didn't have a lot of strong community partner relationships around this particular type of activity. And so starting to build that particular set of relationships and really the ability to work effectively in that space is essentially what this project allowed us to begin to do. So because it deals with so many different community groups, identity groups, it allowed us to start to create some inroad relationships across the board with a topic that speaks to a lot of different people from different angles. The way that report is organized allows the most salient chapter for whether it's LGBTQ history or Native American history, the most salient period of significance to emerge from our particular local context. And so that allows me to just briefly touch on the way that local historic contexts relate to existing national theme studies, national contexts. For civil rights, because the NPS has produced a national context for that particular subject, they've laid out a thematic format, they've laid out the associated property types. So that allows us, working with our consultant, to respond to that existing national framework, put our local story in that national context quite readily. So another way to think about historic context is to look at what has been produced at the national level, what has been produced at the statewide level, and then think about how important is that story likely to be, again, in terms of telling place-based stories for my local community. And then it naturally, essentially dovetails from that overall connected framework. So that's the way that idea emerged. We imagine that, over time, we will do follow-up studies that will allow us to dive deeper into some of these topics. This is a reasonably superficial look at this topic by its very nature. This gets back to scoping these projects in ways that are actually doable within a normal period of time, a couple of years, and not going too crazy with trying to go down every single rabbit hole all the way to the end. So we've got lots of different follow-up recommendations in this particular report. We have lots of follow-up survey activity to do, some of which could be done with grant-funded work, some of which could be done in-house. So I hope that helps kind of think about a way to just approach historic context somewhat strategically and responsively to information that's already out there. And I think I already, mentioned when you end up with information that gives you new stories about new places, then that gives you a whole other process to work through of how are you going to go back and think about that documentation in a new way, that existing documentation that you already have, and how are you going to update it? That's a whole question. That's going to have a different solution for every community. So other ways to think about contexts are by looking at periods of community development. So if we shift to the example that's in the middle of this slide, and you think about, for your particular community, based on what you know about its history, where are you, do you have a lot of potential resources that need to be evaluated and compared with each other and contextualized? And that could be different for every community. Not every community grew up in the same time frame. Here in Fort Collins, like a lot of Front Range communities, the post-World War II period was a time of very rapid expansion. We have quite a large number of post-World War II resources. And of course, we have a lot of questions, like most communities do, about how to think about those as historic resources, since they are more from the recent past. So we embarked on this project in order to create that baseline historic context. It also included a follow-up survey project that was also funded by History Colorado. And it's a really good example of just getting a chapter with a particular period of time, covered on an in-depth basis that will really serve you over time. This is a report that we go back to, especially now that all of these resources are coming online and reaching that 50-year mark. This got out in front of that when it was done, but a lot of those are now hitting that 50-year mark, and we refer to it quite frequently. On the right is an example of a geographic approach to a context report. That is a neighborhood level historic context. Again, that was started with a neighborhood level history, and then was followed up with a survey project that provided related intensive level surveys and recon level surveys for that entire neighborhood, which is also a streetcar neighborhood here in Fort Collins on our trolley line. So it's another example of how that study wasn't just about the period of development in that particular area of town, but also a particular form of urban development and community relationships over time in the form of that streetcar neighborhood. So there's some overlap there. So a lot of times, these are not really that clear cut. There's a mix of both themes and geography and eras, in all of these, but usually they have a particular thrust that's really clear. And I think these three examples illustrate that pretty well. And then moving on to the next slide, I want to give you some examples of these kind of more creative fill in the gaps, mini context or rapid response histories that we have been working on here in Fort Collins. On the left, you can see just a portion of our website, a clip from our web page on Black history. That was a project that started mid-pandemic when everything was pretty much shut down for us. And we wanted to create opportunities for people to learn online through virtual walking tours. And so that's entirely staff-produced content that relied upon, information that we could access readily on the web. We did make some contact with some descendant community members, and were able to include a little bit of that, so it wasn't entirely devoid of community participation and input. But for the most part, because it was essentially a quickie project that we did ourselves, it was meant to be a living document, a project that evolves over time. And so what we've done with that is we have continued to take that basic research that we did starting back in 2020 and add new or develop new products around that information. And so we've got that original virtual walking tour, and there's a virtual brochure that we also have printed out and now use in hard copy form. The information that we gathered for that Black History Tour has become part of the route for our annual Martin Luther King Day Community March, which, because we were lacking that information prior to doing this research, there was really kind of no connection there between that federal holiday and our local history. So it allowed us to make that connection, which was really great and meaningful for us to be able to share that with the community. And now we're starting to create some videos to support and further share that content. And some of those videos are going to be primarily viewed on the website. Some of them can be really short social media clips. So evolving over time, as we get new information, we just go in and we update the web content. We're also offering in the middle of this slide, you'll see that's our senior planner, Jim Bertolini, in the blue shirt there, who's giving a tour to a group of planners from Larimer County government, so one of our partner jurisdictions here in northern Colorado. And the purpose of that tour was to walk those staff members around our Old Town area and connect our historic development patterns to a lot of the current policy and decision-making that's going on here in our area and communities all over northern Colorado. In this particular case, is the interest of that group of people. And this kind of work is so important, especially for those of us in communities that are growing and changing really rapidly, because you not only have a lot of new residents who are not familiar with with those particular stories of communities, but also that those of us who are on staff are often new on staff, new to Colorado, or new to the communities we're living in. And so just thinking about who's using these contexts, who's using the information that you're gathering, not just to identify properties that may be eligible for landmark nomination or National Register listing, but also to think about how to kind of raise the overall level of awareness of local history for people who are in positions to really use that information. So that's something that we do essentially upon request. There's some things that we are starting to kind of do on an annual basis that provide some of those needs to our colleagues in the planning world and city government and local government world. And then on the right, just as a final sort of mini context example, We have started to create a set of Hispanic history tours that we roll out for Hispanic Heritage Month every year. And this is an interesting example of, we have this long-standing history of the Hispanic community in Northern Colorado that is primarily focused on that story as it relates to our sugar factory neighborhoods, and beet sugar labor in our area. So it's not the whole story of the Hispanic community. It's got a very specific focus. It tells some other things fairly well. But when you go back and you look at it, you can say, well, it doesn't cover this, it doesn't cover that. And so, contexts are never entirely complete. You're always thinking of new aspects that weren't covered in that original scope for one reason or another. And so for the tours, that's a great example of, we've got this great information. Now we're meeting new people in the community who are telling us things about neighborhoods and places that we didn't know or that weren't included in that original documentation. We can involve them in creating content or participating in leading tours. And as we continue to amass new information, we're essentially just building out from that original context report that we had. And it's getting some age on it, so it's you don't want to just take it off the shelf and not question what you've got. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn it over to Becca, because she's going to talk some more about just practical tips and summarize some of our key takeaways.
Thanks, Lauren. I wanted to talk a little bit about how to get a context done. And I kind of divided this slide into two sections, with the understanding that most teams really don't have the capacity to produce a large, 100-page formal context in-house. A lot of us are doing many other things, and that's a full-time job, basically. So it's often worth it to use a contractor or contract out to a historian. So I've divided the slide into two different versions of that. So for a formal context where you want full documentation, several dozen pages of content, you would likely have to, and you want to contract out to a historian, you would likely need to create a scope of work and go through the RFQ process. So when you're scoping out your context project, include the basics: time period, geographic range, and themes, but also be sure to consider how this project fits into your larger strategic plan about gathering information about your community. Is it a standalone project, or is it a phase or a chapter in a larger project? If it's going to be a phase or a chapter in a larger project, think about all the information that you've already gathered that should be reflected in your scope somewhere, like mentioned in the introduction, or specifically called out as a task that your contractor will have to absorb that. And spend some time thinking about how you want your contractor to use that information that you already have. Are you asking them to challenge the existing information, this narrative that you already have, or just kind of take those documents as a starting point and then move forward from there? Depending on what kind of context you're developing, you might want to include oral history interviews with community members, or ensure your contractor uses a specific repository or collection of information. So consider and include information about those things and what types of community outreach you'd like at each stage of the project. Do you want pre-project meetings, ongoing reports? Do you want a final report out at the end of the project? And if you want specific recommendations provided about properties to survey and educational opportunities and suggestions. When you're posting your RFP or your RFQ, post on a variety of specialized job posting boards for historians. If you have a purchasing team, work really closely with them so they know where to send it and they don't just go on a generic site somewhere. Be proactive. Bring this project to the attention of historians you already know or you've previously worked with. That would be a good idea there. If you're going after a grant to fund this project, possibly an SHF-funded CLG grant, you'll also need to collect a certain number of quotes for your grant application. I think that number is 3. Most local governments have purchasing requirements, so under a certain amount you can use sole sourcing. Otherwise, you'll have to get multiple quotes. So check your requirements before you go through that process. When you're choosing a contractor, first make sure they meet the basics, the Secretary of the Interior standards for history or architectural history, and consider what your needs are in terms of community engagement and representation. Are you going to need that expertise on your contractor's team, or do you already bring those resources to the table because you already have context to provide access to oral histories or community documents? If you're going to need the contractor to bring that expertise, make sure to ask them what kind of partnership work or outreach experience do they have? What kind of resources can they bring to the table in that respect? Not all historians are experts at community outreach and partnership work. On the other side of this, maybe you don't need a formal 100-page document to get that context information. Like we've talked about, sometimes a shorter, less formal document is what you need. So often when I'm completing site forms, I just need a few paragraphs to contextualize the site that I'm talking about. So I kind of wanted to talk through how I go about that. And I recently completed a short context to help me evaluate a mid-century car dealership here in Fort Collins. So I'm going to use that as an example. First, define your date range and the geographic range of information you want to study. Give yourself some limits. In my example, I wanted to look at the history of car dealerships in Fort Collins and trends in dealership design and architecture. So that gives me, a geographic limit of city limits and the time period of about 1900 to 1964 when the dealership that I was studying was constructed. Then start with your local secondary sources. What kind of information is included in other secondary sources that relates to your particular topic? What are the large overarching trends that other historians that have previously written about your area have noticed? Going back to my example, I referred to a secondary source that talked about the development of gas stations in Fort Collins. That's not specifically about car dealerships, but it did provide me with some broad information about the rise in automobile ownership across the city and the movement of gas stations from clustered near the center of downtown away towards the fringes of the city as automobile ownership grew. Along with local secondary sources, check out broader academic or popular press studies of the topic more generally. Using this information can help you identify where your local history either fits into or kind of differs from other national narratives or state narratives. For my mid-century dealership, I found a great master's thesis that studied mid-century car dealerships in Virginia, not particularly relevant to the state of Colorado, but it did contain some really useful information, and it led me to other sources that talked about dealership design at the national level that were really helpful. So once you understand these larger trends and narratives, kind of dig into your relevant primary sources. That might be census data or city directories or newspapers. That primary source information can help you confirm or refute those general observations that you've already made from your secondary source research. In my example, many of the secondary sources I looked at talked about the movement of car dealerships away from crowded downtowns to the edges of the city in 1940s. But by looking through city directories, I noticed that wasn't exactly the case in the city of Fort Collins. Car dealerships did move towards the edges of the city, but it wasn't until the late 1950s and early 1960s that happened. So we're still following that larger national narrative, but it's a little bit different, specifically in the city of Fort Collins. Provide some examples within your narrative that illustrate the larger trends that you see, and provide some comparative information about other similar sites that still exist. That comparative analysis is especially helpful if you're making an argument about the importance or the significance of a site. And lastly, don't forget your citations. Be clear about where your information is coming from. That doesn't have to be, a perfectly footnoted, formatted Chicago-style citation, right? If you have a public-facing document that you want to keep more informal, maybe include a general source list at the end of your document. And ideally, keep a fully cited version offline that you can refer to later if you need to. So even if you're not using fully formatted citations, just leave yourself a trail of breadcrumbs that you can use in the future if the staff person that wrote that document is no longer there and you need to check it out later. The City of Fort Collins is certainly not perfect at that. If you check out our context online, they're a little bit of a mixed bag. Some are cited really well, and some aren't cited very well at all. So take that kind of as a cautionary tale and do some sort of citing if you're writing a context.
Slide, pull it off the shelf.
I also wanted to provide some ideas about how to pull it off the shelf. We've all been that person, right? The contract ends, we get the document, we're excited to read it, and then we put it on the shelf and we never look at it again. So I wanted to encourage you all to pull those documents off the shelf, even if you think they're outdated, they're 20, 30, 40 years old, they still have information that might be useful to you. So like Maureen talked about, a lot of the more formal context studies provide recommendations on what to do with the information. So, follow up on those. If it's been a few years since those were written, check and see how many of those properties remain standing. If there's a lot that have been demolished in recent years, properties of that type or that relating to that context might be more significant because they're one of a few or last remaining examples. Context studies also help us identify our survey priorities. Again, those recommendations are there, but consider, and if those recommendations are a few years old, consider what's happened in your community since that time. Are you seeing a lot of single family homes being demolished? So maybe you want to focus in on those properties in that context. Is there a big development going on in a place that's identified in that context? Maybe focus in on that area. When you're planning on a new survey or a new context study, consider what the information that you already have. What property types are missing from context studies? What groups of people aren't represented? Do all your contexts end at 1945 and maybe you need some information about mid-century properties? Obviously, use context studies to contextualize your survey results. Using that information in your site forms helps you better understand the site's significance and can strengthen your argument for the property's importance. In addition, if you have someone working on site forms for you, you have a contractor for a Section 106 project or a student intern, provide these documents to them. Even if they're outdated, they still have relevant information. Some of the examples that Maureen gave earlier, use context studies to inform public education programs. Use them to, when you're developing a walking tour, giving a presentation. Give out copies to those who are interested in researching their history of their property if it's relevant. Even just the simple act of digitizing and uploading those documents so they're publicly accessible on your website can help provide a lot of really great information to the public. And last, don't forget to advocate for the relevancy of your work. A lot of us in our organizations feel like we work, in a silo or over here doing our research and it's just us, but the document that you produce, the information that you produce is relevant for your entire organization, right? So be sure to advocate for yourself and circulate your work internally.
Slide, key takeaways.
So to close us out, I just wanted to highlight a few key takeaways that we hope you have gained from our presentation. First, historic contexts are essential to doing defensible historic preservation. They help us to understand how individual stories and places fit into those larger narratives about our neighborhoods or our communities or our state. Contexts help us to demonstrate the importance or significance of a site and why people should care about it. As our colleague Jim Bertolini is very fond of saying, who cares is not a rhetorical question. That's a very important question that you should be answering. Context can help prioritize for larger preservation or planning efforts. So using those provided recommendations for future survey or thinking about what property types or groups of people you don't have information about. Sharing information about the importance of a particular site can also help encourage property owners to nominate their properties for local landmarking or state or national designation. Lastly, recognizing people's stories and histories in official documents and unofficial websites shows the value of our shared history and really legitimizes those stories, right? Sharing the history of LGBTQ residents on the City of Fort Collins website shows that our city, recognizes that these folks have always been a part of our community and that they're an essential part of our community story. So sharing history in this way really supports that sense of connection to our community and shows that our official organizations really value our shared history.
Slide, questions?
That's all we have for you today. I will put a link to the City of Fort Collins historic context in the chat. And we are more than happy to answer any questions you all might have.